In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, the Apostle Paul reminds us the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down arguments, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. Apologetics Profile podcasts are designed to equip you with the resources and tools for engaging the ideas of other religions, worldviews, and cults that challenge your faith. Every Monday, a new conversation to help encourage and exhort you to engage with your non-Christian neighbors in conversation about the truth of the gospel. Here is your host, Daniel Ray.
You might have heard the objection from skeptics and atheists that the Gospels are anonymously written. It seems like an odd charge, given that we have names affixed to the four separate accounts of Jesus' life and ministry: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Skeptics will argue that the authors never identify themselves by name, and that the names we do have were added centuries after the accounts were written. While it is certainly true Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not identify themselves within their accounts, we have good reason to believe they are indeed the individuals who wrote them. Consider this scenario. Imagine a myriad of unnamed gospel accounts circulating for over 200 years throughout the ancient Near East. Then, sometime in the 3rd century, suddenly someone decides to add names to all the manuscripts. How exactly would that be done? There's no internet, there's no cellular communication, no photocopying, no postal system, no way to coordinate such a campaign to make sure the same names get affixed to their proper accounts. If someone wished to add names to the gospel accounts to bolster their credibility and authority, why use two names of individuals who were not apostles? And if the names were added centuries later, how is it that none of the names were mixed up? Why are there no extant gospel manuscripts, which include the first page, which have different names or no names at all? But as our guest this week, resurrection scholar Dr. Gary Habermas notes, the names of the authors are not nearly as important as is the fact that the gospel accounts are the earliest sources we have for Jesus' life and teaching. In the world of ancient history, earliest source material is the most authoritative.
Why don't we treat the Gospels the way we do so much of ancient history? In ancient history, it doesn't depend on you being able to quote who the author was. In ancient history, it depends largely on which is the earliest source. And the Gospels are the earliest written sources for Jesus. So they would be authoritative just by virtue of the fact that they were the earliest.
The Gospels as historical documents have no parallel in the ancient world. They were written just decades after the events they record. Every ancient manuscript in existence today, apart from the Gospels, was written centuries after the events they record, not decades. What every contemporary naturalistic theory of the resurrection lacks is the quality of historical evidence we have with the Gospels themselves. No naturalistic account of Jesus' resurrection has ever adequately been supported with actual documented evidence. Matthew's account of the resurrection, for example, includes the story of the women arriving early at Jesus' tomb, only to find the stone rolled away by an angelic being and Jesus' body no longer there. An angel with the appearance like lightning tells the women, "He is not here, for he is risen." Matthew records that the guards were terrified, shaking with fear and becoming like dead men. An ironic contrast. The living guards become like corpses as a result of a corpse coming back to life. The women left the tomb in fear and great joy. The guards left the tomb in fear and confusion. They were later bribed by the chief priests and told to lie about what happened. Today, it is no different. One either comes away from the tomb with fear and great joy, or with fear and unbelief. The guard's reaction at the tomb is something similar to the reaction of the astronomer Sir Arthur Eddington regarding the astounding discovery in the early 20th century that our universe had a beginning. Eddington said, quote, "Philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant to me. I am simply stating that the dilemma to which our present fundamental conception of physical law leads us. I see no way around it. But whether the future developments of science will find an escape, I cannot predict. The dilemma is this. Surveying our surroundings, we find them to be far from a fortuitous concourse of atoms. The picture of the world, as drawn in existing physical theories, shows arrangement of the individual elements for which the odds are multillions to one against an origin by chance. Some people would like to call this non-random feature of the world purpose or design, but I will call it non-committally anti-chance." End quote. Eddington quite clearly saw design and purpose in the origin of the universe, but refused to concede it. The idea of the universe having a beginning was repugnant to Eddington. His disdain of this idea, however, wasn't finally based on the data. His conclusion was not a scientific one, but an emotional one. For secular scientists, the universe bursting forth from virtually nothing is as startling an idea as is the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. As the late astronomer Robert Jastrow famously quipped, quote, "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." End quote. There exists today a multitude of atheist and skeptic activists who have entire YouTube channels and other social media platforms dedicated solely to undermining the testimonies of the band of theologians who first witnessed their friend, teacher, and Lord alive again. And it just so happens that the very same Jesus who rose bodily from a tomb in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago is the very same Jesus who created the universe ex nihilo. As we continue our conversation with Dr. Gary Habermas this week, we pick up with Gary filling us in with some background details about the source material for the Gospel accounts. Here once again is Dr. Gary Habermas.
All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, virtually everybody thinks that they all had one or more earlier sources to build on. So even if they were anonymous, this is a very well-known move that both evangelical and liberal scholars make. Even if we don't know who they were, it looks like they were building on data, and if they're Greco-Roman bios, if these guys are biographers, they build on earlier sources. You're like, well, like what? Well, Mark is the earliest gospel, and the majority of scholars, this survey is not done by some evangelical head counter, and a critical scholar did a survey of this and found out that a majority of scholars believe that Mark had what's called a pre-Markan, well, if he used it, it's pre-Markan, a passion narrative. And it's a text that starts, well, they disagree. I mean, they don't always agree on the exact verse it starts at, but it basically may talk about Jesus's trial, but for sure crucifixion, burial, and some think it goes as far as the empty tomb. And it stops about where Mark 16:8 stops with the proclamation, or maybe like a verse or two before that, where it said he was raised from the dead. It just says the tomb was empty. Well, a pre-Markan source would be very valuable, but some of these guys say that this source probably dates from the late 30s. And they get an argument for it that's kind of interesting. It's because they seem to be talking about an emperor who's on the throne at that time, and that emperor died in 37 AD. So they say that this source was probably late 30s AD. And I'm not sure that's I'll even criticize the conservatives at this point, or they may not be conservative. They'll say 30s. Who cares? If Mark's written in 60 to 70, and if this source is 45, I mean, I'm adding years to that 37. That's still getting closer and closer to the source. That's Mark. Luke says at Luke 1:1-4, that he interviewed a bunch of eyewitnesses, and he had knowledge of these things from the beginning. Well, what backs Luke up? Luke is accurate in a lot of historical details. Later we find in Acts that he traveled with Paul. So when Paul does research, like going to Jerusalem and interviewing James and Peter, and Luke's his companion, he's getting some facts from the horse's mouth. Again, Ehrman says look how close we're getting to the eyewitnesses here. But also, Luke, for example, Luke 24:34 is an early creed. It's one of the only early things in the Gospels, and it's a reference to Peter seeing Jesus after the resurrection. And it's an early source. So there's Peter. John is believed to use a miracle source, that he had a document that lists the miracles of Jesus. So it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4. The reason critics get this, if you're ever reading your Bible, I remember being a kid and wondering, why does it say, now this is the first miracle he did? Why put first in there? But then later it goes to another miracle and it says, now this is the second one he did. Why are you numbering them? And how do you know it's that order? But they think he's using this numbers source it's called the sign source. Now Matthew, I'm going to be super honest. Matthew is the hardest gospel to tell who the author is. But Papias says that Matthew wrote not Matthew per se, but what he calls the logia, the sayings of Jesus, and every person translated them as they could. Some people have hypothesized that that Matthew didn't necessarily write the gospel, but that he wrote the sayings document that the red letter words depend on, and somebody else put the flesh around it, like the going to this city, going to that city. But Matthew could be the author of the original source. That one's a little more iffy. It's hard to determine the authorship of Matthew. I'm just being straightforward.
I think the way it goes is that the reason the anonymity topic comes up is because none of the Matthew, Mark, or Luke are identifying themselves by name. And for us in the 21st century, Gary, it seems just taken for granted that we would put our own name on our work. So there seems to be something of an anachronism when we're judging these Gospels in light of, well, they don't have their names, and they didn't put their names, and they didn't self-identify. But we're kind of applying a modernistic assumption about how we write books. So I'm going to put my name on my book. And I think for what they were writing, perhaps, as it goes, that if they were doing bios or the biography aspect of it, and they were elevating Jesus, that they didn't want themselves. I mean, even John goes out of his way to say the disciple that Jesus loved without actually saying his name, And so there's this idea that we're not going to put our names on these things, but to judge them as we would as a culture, well, they didn't put their names on them, so they must be anonymous. But that it just seems like it's taking the anonymity.
It doesn't make them untrue.
That's where they want to go with it. It seems
Unfortunately, he passed away. One of the most brilliant New Testament scholars, Richard T. France, a British New Testament scholar.
Yes.
And in his book on the evidence for Jesus, he has a one-liner that's brilliant, and he says this. He says, I would be willing to defend the original authors for the four Gospels, but we don't need to do it. He said, let me make another proposal. Why don't we treat the Gospels the way we do so much of ancient history? In ancient history, it doesn't depend on you being able to quote who the author was. He said in ancient history, it depends largely on which is the earliest source. And the Gospels are the earliest written sources for Jesus. So they would be authoritative just by virtue of the fact that they were the earliest. And I think that's an excellent point by France.
Yeah, you have that. It seems like there's a historical cumulative case, multiple gems that we can put in place like a puzzle. And it's not one independently that makes them all trustworthy or reliable. It seems to be a multitude of different lines of evidence that we can use in order to find credibility with what's being written. One of my favorite things that I love, and I don't hear this much in the debate, is Luke's narrative, where I don't know if this would fall into the Criterion of Embarrassment. I hear that thrown around a little bit, but Luke is writing initially about the resurrection when the women first come to the disciples, and the disciples' initial reaction from the women's testimony is they thought it was foolish talk.
At the tomb, you mean?
At the tomb, yeah. The women come and told the disciples that the Lord is risen, and the disciples think that it's foolish talk, and then we have the road to Emmaus, and the two disciples don't even recognize Jesus. And it was Bob Price, I think, when Bob was on our book club last year, Bob Price, the mythicist, and Bob made the astounding claim that he thought that Luke 24 looked something like an inscription from the Asclepium, that there was this stone inscription of people being healed by the God himself appearing to them after they left Asclepius. And Bob says, well, it just seems to me that Luke would have borrowed that because Luke's a physician, and therefore he wrote Luke 24 after this epigraph and I asked him, I said, Bob, I don't know how you would connect those dots. Can you give me some historical grist that I can go from there to Luke? But he thought, it just seems to me that this would be, but to me, the details that Luke gives there, especially the disciples who would be the authority of the church later, the apostolic authority, they don't believe this. Matthew has that little detail. Some believed, but some didn't believe. Some doubted. Some doubted.
And the resurrection passage, yeah.
So if you're trying to establish the apostolic authority in the early church, these are weird scriptures to include. Even if you're trying to embellish or be creative or make something up, you seem to have, you might be weakening your case by saying the disciples didn't believe them or some didn't believe. Thomas, for example, in John. How do you think these off? I know they're not necessarily part of your minimal facts case, but in terms of the resurrection, do these attest more to something that somebody would have made up, or does this give the Gospels more authenticity when you read things like this?
That's often called the criterion of embarrassment.
Okay, it is that, and
or even enemy attestation. Now, here's some examples just to show you. I guess where you're going. See if I'm I got you right here. The Gospels often say self-deprecating things about themselves, and they're not just general things about their most important people. For example, James is an unbeliever, grew up with Jesus, but just couldn't get himself to believe him. And when Jesus comes to town and the townspeople think he's nuts, the Greek actually does say that he was beside himself, like in two minds, schizophrenia. And the family comes out and pulls Jesus away, and the commentaries say it's like the family agreed with the city's critique of Jesus. That's bad. Thomas doesn't believe, and they go, that's John, that's later. Whatever, just understand what I'm saying. They're not afraid to put criticism out there. Paul held the coats of those who killed Stephen, and he said he brought Christians into the authorities and spoke against them. He gave testimony against them to their deaths. He didn't say he killed them, but he gave testimony against them. And then he finds Jesus. Jesus is in the garden, and he says, your will be done, but can you please take this cup away from me? Whoa, that hurts a little bit. That makes us wonder, because we have whole cantatas things saying he was a man who was born to die. Well, he knew that, but what happened at the end? But he's done. How about John the Baptist? He's in prison. He sends his two disciples to Jesus. And it's not embarrassing enough to say, are you the Messiah? Which John had been proclaiming for years. He says, are you the Messiah, or should we look for someone else? Now, to me, I translate I do it like this. Are you the Messiah? Now, don't get angry. I'm just wondering, because this guy down the street, his name's Krishna? Or his name's Buddha? I'm just wondering. Now, the fact that John, and when they walk away, they haven't even got to John yet. They just walked away, and Jesus called John. That's when he calls him the most righteous man ever born of a woman.
Yeah.
So the most righteous man ever born of a woman asks you if you're the Messiah after proclaiming it for years. And secondly, when he said, should we start looking for somebody else? I mean, shape up. You haven't done anything yet. He doesn't say that, but it's almost like, do something.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here in prison. Will you do something to these Romans? I mean, I don't know. But these are all, and there's many more.
Yeah.
There's many more things. When the disciples and the males come and take Jesus away, kind of agreeing with the Downs people, Mary's included there. Now you can defend Mary, and you can say, she's being a typical mom. She's trying to keep peace between the boys. It's very possible. But you can also say, Mary's letting a little bit of her unbelief show.
Yeah.
Well, that would be a rough one.
Right.
And so how about dying? We died on the cross. Well, that's pretty straight. There's almost nobody disagrees with that. But can the Son of God die? Or Mark 13:32. My coming is going to be from the lightning. It comes to the east, the west. 2 verses later. But I don't know when this is going to happen. Some people think that's the most embarrassing.
Yeah.
I had a buddy, a professor, well-trained, who said, if I could excise one verse from the New Testament, I would excise Mark 13:32, because I'm embarrassed that in the same passage where he says, I'm the Son of God, he goes, I'm the Son of God and I don't know something.
What?
What kind of Son of God is that?
Or when his robe is touched and he says, who touched me?
Who touched me?
Yeah.
Now, in that case, some commentaries might say, he knew, he just wanted her to identify herself. It could be not. But the other verse is a lot stronger.
Right.
I don't know.
I've always thought, when I've come to that passage, I've always thought it was Jesus' divinity and Jesus' humanity. That the human Jesus, I don't know how the divine and human interacted, but I think that there's something of Jesus' humanity. Same thing in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let this cup pass from me. Because if God answered his prayer, we're all toast. I mean, and the world is hanging in the balance. The human existence, our future.
No, don't do that.
Don't pray that you don't want to do this, Lord. But there it is, I think, in his humanity. The other thing, Gary, I wanted to touch on, and this comes from, I haven't read it yet. I have the best of intentions of reading it. He's passed away since, and I know you probably know him, Larry Hurtado.
Oh, yeah, right. I was only with him once, but I know
he
him,
wrote this mammoth book called Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah, it's a great book.
And, it's a very fair and balanced and scholarly look at why are these Jewish people calling this man Lord? There is nothing in Judaism that allows for worshiping a human being.
Or that a Messiah would even be deity.
That's right. And this is unbelievably unlike anything in the Roman or Greek pantheon. Nothing in Egypt is like this. There's nothing in Babylonian like this. What in the world made these people call this guy Lord? It seems to be, Gary, that the very fact that Jesus rose from the dead caused this small group of little Jews to gather together in secret and worship this man as I am.
Right. There were four scholars at that time: Hurtado, Richard Bauckham, James D.G. Dunn, and Martin Hengel. Now, Hengel died.
Where does France fit into all that? Is he before them?
Where does who?
R.T. France? Was he before?
France would be from about the same time. Now, I'm guessing. I don't know exactly the year he died, but it was probably close to when Hengel died.
Okay.
Back then.
Okay.
And so you got these four guys, and they're called, euphemistically, they're called the High Christology Club. Because, now, here's what's neat about them. I had a private lunch one time with Richard Bauckham. I had a private lunch with James D.G. Dunn. They both, you say, oh, you're name dropping. I'm trying to get a story across here. If I don't drop the name, you're going to say, well, you weren't the witness. This is hearsay. So they're going to get you coming and going. No, I sat there alone with them at a table. Nobody was around. And both Dunn and Bauckham told me they used to take the view that it took until John to unpack the Christology of Christ, because it was so deep, it took 60 years for them to figure out what Jesus was really saying. And they often cite these words of the American New Testament scholar who died in the 90s, Brown, who we mentioned him, he says, it's pretty cool. He says, if Jesus had come back about 100 AD and had read John's Gospel, he would have said, yeah, that's where I was going. So I assume Brown took this view, Bauckham, and Dunn, at least, and it was the most popular view, that it took 65 years to unpack this highly, potentially philosophical, heavy stuff. It took a while to unpack it there. And then they both went on to tell me, both Dunn and Bauckham, they've now totally switched, and they think this is a stunning comment. Bauckham's famous for quoting it, but didn't come from him. The earliest Christology was the highest Christology.
So he's saying Mark was as high a Christology as anything.
Way earlier than Mark.
Wow.
They're saying the early creeds from 30 to 35 AD were the highest Christology.
So 1 Corinthians 15 is higher than what
the creed. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15, not the chapter.
Okay.
1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 5. Yeah, and it's probably that. The Jesus Seminar, who's very critical, right?
Yeah.
They, depending on how you count, they've rejected 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. They say that the majority of the majority of the Jesus Seminar thought that the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 7, they thought it predated Paul's conversion. So that when Paul left for Damascus, that creed was already in existence. So this early, I thought John had the high Christology. Well, think about this from the early creeds. Philippians 2, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. He's in the form of God. That's a Greek word for morphe. Form in English doesn't mean much, but morphe in Greek, the primary meaning is of the same essence, of the same nature. That's one. You've got several comments, the Acts sermon summaries, which are types of creeds. They say Jesus was seated on the right hand of God. A lot of scholars believe that was the most blasphemous phrase, to say that he thought he was such that he could share God's throne. And that's a high one. If you go back to Mark 2, it's not a creed, but if you go back to Mark 2, he forgives sin, and the leaders call it blasphemy. So you start putting these things together, we got one to go. But every knee will bow, he'll be worshipped, every knee bow and every tongue confess. Secondly, he forgave sin. He occupied God's throne, and his existence was in the past, forever, back. Not as a child of Bethlehem. As the Old Testament says, his goings forth have been from eternity. He's pre-existent, and Philippians 4 teaches
what's
that.
the confession of the first disciples? And I think it's John 1:145. Come, we have found the one of whom Moses and the prophets have written. So this, and then his confession in John 8:58, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am."
Yeah.
But you're establishing this pattern that the Christology of the worship of Jesus is prior to the Gospels. We find in the epistles.
Because first of all, critics aren't going to they're not going to like John. Secondly, that's that phrase that it took them 65 years to unpack it.
Right. So.
Thirdly, John 8, before Abraham was I am, and I and the Father are one, are both not as straightforward as you'd like to be. Before Abraham was I am, they misunderstood him. The leader, how can you say that you're not even 50 years old? So they misunderstood the point. I and the Father are one. They picked up stones to kill him, and yet Jesus said husband and wife are one. So there's different interpretations of one. So rather than using John, both because of the date and the fact that those aren't the clearest references, I would use the creeds from 30 to 35, which is the reason why a Bauckham and a Dunn come all the way back to this early Christology. Now to go take that from that point back to the point you mentioned in starting this one, the resurrection gave rise to these teachings. Okay, if you ask the question, if these teachings came from the first 5 years after the cross, what was the canon that fired out this boom? The message goes out. It's the resurrection.
Yeah.
The resurrection, and it goes something like this. He's dead. Oh my gosh. And we call it Black Saturday. John says the disciples were hiding behind locked doors for fear of the Jews. Everybody's scared. They let the women go to the tomb by themselves. By the way, another embarrassing passage. The men don't even go as bodyguards. Now they go after the women go. I guess they think it's safe, but they let the women go by themselves, and they're hiding. It's Black Saturday is a rough time, but on Sunday morning, Jesus is raised, and I think something like this happens. He's raised. How do you know? Peter saw him. The 12 saw him, and they're starting to get some lineup here of data, and all of a sudden, I think something like this happens. Whoa, time out. Think about this. If he's the Messiah, and God raised him from the dead, he didn't raise himself from the dead, because I'm talking as if this is what the Jews, their reasoning. He didn't raise himself from the dead because, in my experience, dead men don't do a whole lot. So God had to act on him. Humans can't create life from non-life anyway. If God raised the dead, well, he had to approve of what he taught. He had to approve. I mean, in my book, God doesn't bless heresy. Mm-hmm. So if Jesus wasn't speaking the truth, and why didn't God why didn't he raise Moses from the dead, or Elijah, Elisha, Daniel, David? Why didn't he raise them from the dead? Well, you know something? They never claimed to be deity.
Yeah.
And if he claimed to be deity, and then they just go, well, he must be who he said he was, or God wouldn't have raised him. And there's the canon, there's the early high Christology in the first 5 years.
Yeah. Can we add Colossians to it? Paul says of Jesus being the firstborn from the dead. When is this being written?
Well, critics don't...
Colossians is a disputed letter.
Colossians.
Okay.
Now, Tom Wright, there's some big guys who will do it.
Is it just writing style? Did he use a secretary? Is that what the...
Yeah, you know what? We heard a lecture this week from Tim McGrew, and Tim makes some interesting points. And what he said was, he gave several examples. He says in Shakespeare and in these other writers, you'll see them use a word. They'll use it 5 times in like one chapter, and they never use the word again in all their many writings. Wow. Why right there? So if that's true, and there's many ancient people who do that, he gave example after example after example. Why do we judge Paul in Colossians and other verses for using language that doesn't sound like Paul, but we don't do that with Shakespeare, we don't do it with any other people?
Right, and I've heard very common examples too of, look, if you write a letter to a friend versus your 1,100-page magnum opus that's coming out next year, your writing is going to be distinctively different.
Exactly. Whether you're doing an argument, whether you're writing a letter to mom.
Exactly.
Whether you're writing a letter, it is. Now, there is a critic who's I think is a lot better to listen to at this point, who makes the point that if you're going to judge, he's a Greek expert, and he says, his name is Johnson, and Luke Timothy Johnson. And Johnson says, when I teach he's at Emory University, a very good university, and he says, when I teach intro to New Testament, I use all of the epistles that have Paul's name on it. I don't just take the 7 that the critics do. I take all of them. And he says, the reason I do it is, you cannot say Paul wrote this and Paul didn't write that based on how many words show up in one book that don't show up in another. So he buys this criticism, and he says he uses the whole Pauline corpus.
In terms of trustworthiness, what are the skeptic arguments for why those names, Gary? I mean, I know your
the
field
4 that are there,
right? I know you're laser focused on resurrection, but why? Consistently in every extant manuscript that we have, where we have the beginning of the Gospels, we don't have a blank page. We have Matthew for Matthew, Mark for Mark, Luke for Luke, and John for John. Why those? It seems to me, because the skeptic argument is, well, they were fixed later to give them weight and authority as they went out from the.
John is the only one out of 4 that's well known.
Why would you add, if you're trying to make these authoritative and you're making this up? Why would you not just put apostolic names? Sure. And 2 guys that may or may not be known by people?
Now Matthew's an apostle, but he's not a very well known one.
Right.
If you pick him. Mark and Luke are companions. Well, they're in pretty good shape, but why use them at all if they're not the cutting edge? Yeah.
Right. But that just seems to be, they don't have an argument for why these names and not some other names. They're just anonymous, and they're almost saying to the point, the anonymity, the skeptic's point is almost like they're saying they didn't write those. If you know John didn't write John, then what you're saying tacitly is that you know what Johannine writing would look like, right? If I know that that's not a letter from Gary Habermas, I know what Gary's letters would look like. I would have to say that I would know what your writing style is. So I don't know. It just seems like it's trying to throw incredulity and giving us reasons for not trusting.
It's raising doubts.
It's raising doubts, right?
And you have to be honest. They don't believe, so they will try to raise doubts. We do believe, so we'll try to throw out every little plus thing. It's what everybody does. Hey, I'll tell you something that might come in here. Mike Licona, well-known New Testament scholar at Houston Baptist University, had a grad student who did his master's thesis by interviewing, he didn't interview like in person. He read the works of over 200 critical scholars that include liberal, moderate, conservative, but here's what they all had. They had like terminal degrees, teaching positions, they're in the general area, New Testament, classics, historians, and they're in the area. And he interviewed them, and not everybody answered every question. But here's one of the questions. It was about the book of Mark, was the interview. And the question was, who wrote Mark? If I remember that Mark was favored definitely by these 200 plus scholars, about not quite 3-1, but more than 2-1. Said Mark. Okay, another question: was Peter one of his sources, the main one, or one of his sources? Just over 50-50 said Peter was his source.
Wow.
So this is across 200, and again, liberal, conservative, moderate. I was thinking, who did I leave out? But you come up with Mark being the majority and Peter being just barely the majority. So there is a lot of support. Oh, by the way, the date, most of them put Mark back around 60, 65, not up around 70.
Interesting. Wow.
So this, and it was so good. His thesis was so good. Mike encouraged him to go on for a PhD and build on this, and then add a lot more material to it and make it into a PhD dissertation.
Yeah. So it does seem to me, I mean, I think there's sense in the early church tradition about they knew more than, I mean, we have on-the-ground people that probably knew more about where these came from than we do today.
Right. We're largely defending the Gospels here, and I think that's firsthand. But if we go back to the earlier one of defending individual facts to get to resurrection, here's another whole example. Jesus is a healer, an exorcist, and he does nature miracles. Dominic Crossan says the greatest natural miracle, according to the New Testament, the earliest natural miracle is the resurrection. But so critics don't like natural miracles because telling the wind and waves to stop, it makes you look something more than a man. But on healing and exorcisms, I saw a source from a skeptic who said that about 100% of scholars, now it's not that high, but he was saying everybody today believes that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. And when you go, exorcist, do you believe in demons? He would say, I don't believe in demons, and I don't think so. Jesus didn't cast one out. But I think the historical situation where people thought this guy was demon-possessed and Jesus touches him and he's all this, he says that historical account happened like that, whatever happened. Now, healing is more straightforward, and there's a lot of healing. Healing can be done with drugs today. Healing can be done with surgery. Healing can be with psychological healing, depression, anxiety, best examples. And oftentimes in some of the tests, they work better than our medicinal rates. So you can heal psychologically. These critics believe that Jesus actually healed. So if Jesus is a healer, and if he cast out demons, not literally, but where the situation where he was doing it is true, according to the skeptics, that, think about all the things we've done here. There's sources behind each one of the Gospels. The Gospels may have circulated with names on them. Whatever they are, R.T. France, whatever they are, they're the earliest sources. They beat all the other secular sources by a mile. Oh, I think the cases where he exorcised were kind of like really close to what happened. He healed, and you keep making this list, authorship, Mark, and so on. You're starting to put together a lot of arguments that back up the Gospels. I just named 8 of them.
Yeah. So I know you addressed your works coming out, your big ones coming out next year. And you've tackled some naturalistic objections to the resurrection.
Yeah, no, that's volume 2.
That's volume 2.
First one is the positive evidence.
Positive evidence for the resurrection. Right. So, and you've presented this in a multitude of ways that you've called the minimal facts, and you and I have talked about the minimal facts. Some of your critics about minimal facts have come from within Christendom. And what do you think? Legitimacy, illegitimacy, strengths, weaknesses of people's criticism of your approach. I know that you've been very congenial when you handle criticism with this, but I think the one, and I may be misunderstanding it too, the one criticism that I've seen suggests that because you're focused on these facts, whatever they might be, that you're giving the impression that the rest of the New Testament is not relevant.
Baloney. Because nobody knows this because the thing's not out yet. But in volume 1, which is about 1,250 pages, and it's on the evidence, I spent 600 pages on the minimal facts, and in a second 6, which are not minimal facts but are closely aligned and basically everybody agrees, whereas the first 6, everybody agrees. I mean, within reason. But, so that's 600 pages. But I spend 200 pages defending each of the resurrection chapters in the Gospels. So I do the long approach that goes from the text. So I have Matthew 28, Mark 16, there's not even any appearances there according to most people. So Mark 16, 8, only 8 verses. Luke 24, John 20, John 21, and the first only 11 verses of Acts. I spent 200 pages on, Matthew, Luke, 2 and John are 4 chapters and little tiny 2-verse snippets from Mark and Acts 1. And from only 4 chapters and 2 snippets, I have 200 pages. Yeah. So my point is to spend 200 pages unpacking what we can learn from those 4 chapters. It's not a minimal facts argument. So I think there's another way to go there at these things. Here's another way. My research assistant, he's been with me for so long. We're getting close to 10 years. I think it's 9 right now. In his meantime, he earned his MA before he came on board with me. He has since finished his PhD. And this guy, Ben Shaw, just got a contract with a major publisher, some would argue the number 1 Christian publisher in the country. He got a contract, and he uses a baker's dozen arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. He uses 13 different arguments for reliability. And he uses things like minimal facts, reliability, which we've mostly been doing in this thing, archaeology, the way historians go after things. He's got 13 separate ones. So as I make clear to these people who think, I'll say, you may not like my minimal facts argument, but whatever you do, don't think I think it's the only way to get there.
Right.
Because here's my teaching assistant who uses, my research assistant who uses 13 of them. And in my own big book, I have 2 featured at 600 and 200 pages respectively.
So we don't want to. So the error I'm hearing you say is that people are minimizing your minimal facts. They're not understanding the broader picture.
Well,
of what
I think they're not getting in its context. And they don't get the nuances. Because
for me, and if I answer that critique, for me, I will just say, as I did last year when we talked, I said, look, just think of it as I don't mean this in any kind of disrespect whatsoever, but if you were on Family Feud, and the guy asks you name the top 5 things you find in a kitchen junk drawer, people would say the top 5 things, but there's 100,000 things in a kitchen junk drawer. We're just saying these are the big ones, but everything in that junk drawer can be utilized, and you would find it. People wouldn't argue about these things necessarily being there.
Yeah, like a pair of scissors would be more common than a corkscrew.
Right, but you would find a corkscrew. Yeah, and that's kind of the way I looked at it. Like if you're talking to a skeptic and you want to go right down to the basics, you got 10 minutes. here's what Gary says, and here's what's useful. Here's something to have in your toolbox. If you need to uncork the wine in 5 minutes, there's a junk drawer. You're going to find something in the junk drawer. Here it is. This is a useful tool. This is a useful tool. But it's not. Please don't stop there, right? That's kind of the way I've seen it. It's just
and you might have one here that works okay, but maybe this one over here works better. So
right.
We can use different strokes for different folks, different tools for different. Some people, they might try to use a saw on something and hack at it, or like a hacksaw and just hack at it, and somebody could say, do you think it works better with an axe? Yeah. I mean, you pull out different tools, and I think that's what we have in the New Testament. We have, if you use Ben's approach, he's doing 13 methods, 13 ways to get there. And I think that's very important.
That's fine, fantastic. But you're not, by any means, you're not limiting this discussion to we should only use these 5 facts.
Absolutely not.
No. Real quick, your thoughts on? I know the empty tomb kind of goes back and forth within this realm of arguments.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the empty tomb as a place to begin with people?
Empty tomb has never been one of my minimal facts, but it is one of the next 6 that I tell you are close, but for whatever reason we don't include it. I say we, there's a few people who do minimal facts arguments now. I don't include them. Bill Craig includes it, the empty tomb, but we're doing something a little bit different, the two of us. So to me, I wouldn't use the top 6, but I think if I were going to go to 7, the very next one, that's not a minimal fact, but the next one on my list, I'd go to empty tomb. So it's not far away. Here's why I make the distinction. The empty tomb has as many arguments in its favor, over 20. And when I say arguments, I don't mean arguments the way a lot of people think evangelicals do. Oh, here's a verse, here's a verse, here's a verse. I mean 20 arguments the way critics make arguments.
Okay.
Major and minor, 20. Empty tomb qualifies on the arguments, but it doesn't qualify on the second far back. This is nowhere near as important. But the second rule is critics almost unanimously admit this. And the empty tomb does not have that kind of 90-something% whatever. And that's not I get blamed for saying, Habermas won't let a minimal fact come unless it's 95%. I've never said anything like that. It's just that scholar's line, that's just how many are there. I don't ever require anything. But I will tell you this, back when I published figures years ago on the empty tomb, I said that about 75% of scholars believe the empty tomb. I just did a head count when I did volume 1, I just did a head count on over 200 scholars, and the empty tomb has gone up from 75, and I didn't doctor this to get the higher number, but the very first time I spun the numbers, 80.1 accept the empty tomb and 19.9 reject it. I used to be, I would say, talking a little more generally, 75-25. But 80.1 to 19.9 with over 200 critical scholars, left, right, and center, liberal, moderate, conservative.
This episode of Apologetics Profile has been a production of Watchman Fellowship Incorporated, Arlington, Texas. For more information on this and any of our other podcast episodes or resources, visit watchman.org today.